Okay, so everyone's heard of the dead internet theory by now, right? If you want the condensed version, this theory is basically the idea that the internet has been by and large overrun by bots, with there being more and more bot traffic and interactions compared to humans, to a point where in many places you'll find bots interacting with a bunch of other bots. The internet can also be argued to no longer be a place to find proper information, save for a couple of locations, or the information you do find is regurgitated AI or generic article slop. But that's how the internet is now. What we need to talk about is what events caused the most damage to, or what eventually killed the internet. And to do that, we have to go over some internet history. We're going to go chronologically from the beginning of the internet all the way to the present, highlighting certain innovations or events, whether general or specific, which can be argued to have destroyed the internet. So starting from the beginning, we have ARPANET. This was a Department of Defense project designed to link lots of computer systems together into a larger network, with many of these being hosted at universities. However, since this was still a government project for the Department of Defense, this was largely for government use only. Also, since it was the Cold War, the main goal of the system would be the ability to continue communications should something happen to the regular telephone network. The funny thing about this was that the Soviets had a similar technology in development at the time, called the OGAS, but it was abandoned within a decade. Now, what does ARPANET have to do with the internet? Well, not much honestly, especially since this was less of the internet and more like a very early proto-internet. I guess if you really want to stretch the definition, the first mass advertising message was sent on ARPANET, even though this wasn't supposed to be allowed, so that could be considered the first internet advertising. I'm sure there's someone out there who argues that the internet should have never been made and should have only been relegated to government use, but honestly that sounds stupid at best and terrifying at worst. At this time, however, the whole system was largely for government use only. There needed to be some sort of other network specifically for users. Oh wait a second, that's Usenet. Usenet was started in the late 1970s and early 80s on a sort of, quote, poor man's ARPANET. Now the difference here was that this primarily began in universities, except it wasn't for government use, so that meant actual users could use Usenet. And okay, yeah, I know, technically BBS predated Usenet. The reason I'm not really including BBS in here is that instead of being a much larger network, BBSs were something more akin to a bunch of smaller isolated networks. It was more like a community bulletin board that you could dial into. You know, hence a bulletin board system. Usenet, on the other hand, was a much larger and more interconnected network. Almost like an internet or something. Of course, there was a catch. You had to have access to the network, and while less restrictive compared to ARPANET, you still usually had to have access to the university network. This meant that you had to be near a university which even had Usenet in the first place, then you had to actually be attending said university, or perhaps be faculty there, and even then sometimes Usenet access would be restricted to only those students studying in specific fields. Later on, this would be expanded out when ISPs would begin offering Usenet access, but that gets into early internet history. Though I suppose it would be fitting to add that someone could likely argue that this was when the internet died. Why? Well, I'm going to assume the theory of it being because the horrible masses all got their grubby little hands on it. Yeah, spoiler alert, but this is going to be a recurring pattern. But okay, enough about the very beginnings of the internet. Okay, enough background info. Let's talk about the internet proper. Or, I suppose the 90s internet. This was what many people in large part call Web 1.0. Web 1.0 was notable for its rather decentralized nature, and just the fact that it had very few users, certainly compared to today. Most of the people online were, let's face it, nerds, and it still took some technical know-how to get online. Combine this with the fact that people had to dial in, with dial-up being 52K at the best of times, the internet consisted largely of static pages with text, maybe the odd early internet GIF or low-quality JPEG, and not much more. Video sharing was for the most part a pipe dream, and centralized services were largely non-existent. People made their websites for their own specific things, whether a personal blog, the one person on the planet who cared about a specific plant, and so forth. Even most corporate sites from this time shared a similar design model. See the original Space Jam website as an example. While yes, there were certainly more people on the internet by the end of the 90s, I can't really think of much in this era that I'd call a real death of the internet moment. Now let's talk about the dot-com bubble and Y2K. Let's actually start with Y2K first since it's simpler. Back in the early days of computing, systems would shorten the year counter down to 2 digits instead of 4. This was fine until the new millennium was approaching, where it was thought that many computers would get confused and think it was the year 1900, then planes fall out of the sky, nuclear power plants go haywire, you get the gist of it I'm sure. What does this have to do with the internet? Well, a lot of systems that needed to be upgraded to be Y2K compliant hadn't been connected because there was simply no need. But hey, since they were being upgraded, why not connect some of these systems to the internet as well? Luckily, as we all know, Y2K didn't cause the apocalypse and everything was fine. So let's move on to the dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble was, in brief, a bunch of investors seeing a new shiny piece of tech, being convinced that it was the next big thing, and then blindly putting everything they owned into it. Because everything needed a website, and the internet could be limitless potential. I'll give you one guess as to where that line of thinking got them to.
Wah, wah, wah. Will you cut that out?
But why bring this event up? After all, wasn't the result a bunch of investors losing money? Well, sort of. The main reason I bring this up is because a lot of what would have been up-and-coming websites got destroyed because of this event. Investors didn't think that the internet was a total loss, but they wanted to ensure that they had some idea what they were getting into. This seems to have inadvertently started Web 2.0 in a sense, where instead of having a lot of websites with many dedicated to niche hobbies and activities, you would instead get increasing centralization. In fact, I've already hinted at it, so let's talk about Web 2.0. As I previously mentioned, Web 2 was the beginning of the centralization of the internet. Now, to be fair, centralization wasn't and isn't all bad. Remember how I said video sharing was basically a pipe dream back in the 90s? Well, now you had websites dedicated to specifically that on a large scale. Or hey, if you wanted to go on social media, you could do that now in one or a couple of central spots. But the biggest benefit of centralization is also its greatest downside. If the website goes down for a while, you don't have as many other options. If you don't like a certain website, but it's what most others use, well, you're sort of stuck. And depending on the website or service, it might be rather difficult to even escape should you not like it. Web 2 didn't extinguish the old internet all at once, but let's be honest, it's certainly left its impact. There have also been other impacts caused by Web 2, but we'll save that for a bit later. Otherwise, I don't think I'll really call this the death of the internet by any means, certainly not on its own. The iPhone was introduced back in 2007. Wow, has it really been that long? Sure, there were technically internet-capable phones before the iPhone, but this was the thing that really caused what we now call smartphones to take off. Now, unlike our smartphones of today, these original ones weren't all that powerful, mainly good for some lightweight apps, or, you guessed it, web browsing. So a bunch of companies looked at that and realized that it would be a good idea to make websites more mobile friendly. Now this generally went okay enough for a while, but things started to go south when everything started being catered towards mobile users at the expense of desktop users. This also wasn't helped by graphic design changes to whatever flat nonsense replaced the beloved skeuomorphic designs of yesteryear. And because everything had to be designed around smartphones, instead of leaving well enough alone, the desktops got infected by this garbage as well. In fact, let's just take YouTube as an example. What have we lost because of smartphones? Highly customizable channel pages? Well, we won't be needing those. After all, smartphone users won't be able to see them perfectly, so we should make sure that everyone else suffers instead. Oh no, smartphone users won't be able to see annotations. Better remove those entirely too, even though they were a really cool feature. Oops, it's time to change the layout again to make things look even more mobile friendly, even though you're on a desktop. Phones also lowered the barrier of entry to certain styles of video, such as the dreaded vertical video. I'm still personally annoyed that vertical videos have become and remained as popular as they are. Seriously guys, is it that difficult to rotate your phone 90 degrees? Oh, and of course, there's another argument that's going to come back, that being how the lowered barrier to entry caused the internet to die because it became an awful place where the horrible masses could get their grubby little hands on the internet. Yeah, I told you that'd be a recurring pattern. But let's move on to the next topic. Whoa, wait a second. What does Trump of all people have to do with the internet? Well, quite a few things really, but I'd argue the most important thing has to have been the sudden politicization of the internet. Now, some could argue that this had already sort of been happening before, but this certainly got kicked into overdrive by Trump's first campaign. You know, all the memes and such. The realm of politics had generally not overlapped in such a manner with the internet, save for occasional government attempts to censor it. However, Trump's campaign suddenly caused this to be a massive issue that everyone had to care about and, more importantly, take a side on. This was no doubt compounded by the fact that a lot of people had smartphones now, where they could hear the latest weird or dumb thing about each side. This also spread beyond Trump's campaign into other social or political topics, where if you didn't agree or simply just didn't want to hear about it, then obviously you must be a bad person. All jokes aside, the whole thing was a mess. Granted, I think it's sort of calmed down since a lot of people collectively got rather exhausted with hearing about this stuff nonstop. However, you can still see the influence of this event to this day, and certainly throughout the remainder of the 2010s. I mean, let's even take things like demonetization. That didn't used to be a thing, but now that companies wanted to ensure that nothing strayed too far in either direction because of all that happened, this caused overcorrection. In tandem with centralization, we suddenly had a much more censored internet, filled with people spouting off political views that were also at times trying to see just how much they could say before crossing the line. Do I think this killed the internet? No, not really. It was really annoying, and even its further impact on things like games, shows, movies, and so on are a story for another time, but at the end of the day, it didn't destroy the internet. Now COVID, much like the Trump topic, wasn't really much of a technological change. In fact, I'd argue that the second half of the 2010s was largely stagnant from a technological standpoint. All that COVID did was ramp all the previous topics up to an 11. Suddenly, there was that much more centralization, more censorship, and more political infighting, and also how if you didn't agree with a certain opinion, you're a terrible person. I assume by now you've heard the phrase terminally online. If you haven't though, I think you can guess what it means simply by the way it's phrased. Well, this whole time period was quintessential terminally online, except it was also most people because they had all locked themselves in their homes with not much else to do. Was it bad? Of course. Was it annoying? You bet. But was it the end of the internet? Again, no, it was just a bunch of the previous issues getting worse. Now luckily, this too has calmed down somewhat, but unfortunately, something far worse has taken its place. We're about up to the present day, so I think you all know what it's time to talk about. Yup, you already know what's destroying the internet. You see, AI had slowly been building in the background, with barely anyone paying it much mind. Back in 2020 and 2021, some demonstrations of AI generation of images took place, which looked pretty laughable for the time. I think a lot of people felt that they didn't need to worry about this for a few years at minimum. This was also the case for text generation, which, while still pretty laughable, had existed for a bit longer. In fact, some people will still argue that these things are still a joke, or if nothing else, painfully generic. However, what this did was give even just a small group of people the ability to put out tons of content all at once, clogging up already full places with even more spam. And honestly, that's what I'll call it, spam. I know some people can argue that AI is a tool, And for certain specific applications, I could agree, but even then, for every person who's using it as a genuine tool, it seems that there are many others, and certainly many other instances to be seen, where it's being used to generate garbage over and over, forever. It enables more scams, clogs up places, and I haven't even fully gotten into the effect it's had on websites. You know, that website that you've used for years and that you like? Well, now they're introducing some sort of AI slop into the service. This could be the ability for users to generate their own AI content, which also competes with the real things posted by actual users. Or maybe it could be the website saying that anything you've ever uploaded to their service is now being scraped into their own AI model, and if you have any objections, then tough luck, buddy. Or it could be the fact that some of these AI models simply scraped things up without people's permission anyway. I haven't even mentioned the scam bots that are seemingly everywhere now. Most of this is just spam, but even worse. Remember how I mentioned the lowering of the barrier to entry for some of these things? Well, in this case, it's lowering the barrier of entry to literal spam. I wouldn't even mind if the AI stuff had its little corner of the internet and that was about it, but it doesn't, and that's the problem. It's infecting everywhere else. People can put out as much slop as they want, and it's difficult to filter through all of it. You will inevitably run into AI spam comments or bots, AI generated images, videos with generic sounding AI narration, and so on. But hey, at least we can say that there's enough AI slop to feed you your entire life. ChatGPT, generate some more big-breasted AI women, the cougar's starving! Let's take a brief detour and talk about enshittification, which is now an actual term. In short, it's certain things getting worse and worse. It can be the quality of products, how certain things take longer to do for the same quality, or in the case of the internet, how certain websites or services have just gotten worse, whether being more difficult to navigate or intentionally obtuse. Of course, the easy example to use has to be Google. It's well known by now that Google has inserted tons of meaningless bloat into search results, which at best clog up the results, forcing the user to scroll more for what they were looking for. Or now, due to factors such as search engine optimization, it can be difficult to find things to begin with, short of adding things to the search that would have been unnecessary. But hey, at least Google can put mandatory AI into search results, which can be wrong half the time to begin with. That can also be blamed on things such as AI-generated articles, which doesn't help matters at all. Seriously, if I just wanted to know what an AI thinks of something that it can't actually answer, I'd just ask the AI. Something else I fear with AI is some people deferring to the AI as the ultimate arbiter of truth. Guys, the AI doesn't know everything. But okay, let's get back to the point. What really did the internet in? Well, if you want to know where the true end was, it's pretty obvious that it was AI, and I don't think I need to elaborate on that much further. However, where do I think the beginning of the decline was? Honestly, I think the thing that really kicked off the beginning of the end was the smartphone. I know that given the context, that might sound a bit elitist given the idea of the barrier to entry being too low, but honestly I think that the bar was set to a point where it inevitably caused many of the complaints that could be said about the other topics forward of it. I seriously doubt that many of the issues caused surrounding Trump or COVID, at least with regard to the impact of being on the internet, could have really happened without the ability for everyone to have a small computer in their pocket at all times. That's not to say it wouldn't have existed, but it would have been far more tempered compared to how it was in our timeline. Even AI, despite all my issues with it, would likely be less of an issue in the absence of the smartphone. Now look, this isn't trying to say that there are no benefits to smartphones. In fact, I think there are plenty. I'm just trying to say where I believe the internet's decline truly started. I know some people might also try to argue further back, such as with centralization, but honestly, I think centralization would have been an inevitability beyond a certain point, given just how large the internet became. Well, that's all for now. And I'm curious to know where you guys think that the internet's decline truly began, or maybe there's a key event that I missed. In any case, thank you all for watching, and take care.